Okay, now that we have prepared our ledgers, we need to draw a summary of this. So let's just go through our ledgers once. We just finished off our general ledger where we saw our cash account. Remember their balances. Cash has a debit balance 582. Then we drew the bank account, debit balance as well. Capital account had a credit balance. Then we drew the sales account. Sales account, that's an income account, had a credit balance. Purchases had a debit balance. You guys can see the values as well. I will need this for the summary. Rent account, expense account, debit balance. Carriage account, also a debit balance. Before the general ledger, we had prepared our sales and purchases ledger. I've extracted the list from there. So from the sales ledger, we got the list of trade receivable. It's the same exercise going on. The total of trade receivable was 1682. Now one thing to remember, trade receivables have a debit balance, so that's 1682 with a debit balance. Whereas trade payables from the purchases ledger have a credit balance, amount 2332 comes over here. Okay, now once we have this, we can now prepare our summary. The trial balance essentially will help you prepare financial statements, which is how the information is communicated to the end user. But before we do that, we need to have an arithmetical check over here. So the trial balance will check that for every debit entry, there is an equivalent credit entry. So if you have made any mistake, that can also be detected over here. So after we have prepared all our T accounts, we have calculated their balances, we will now present a summary of this trial balance. The trial balance should be prepared something like this. So we will have a debit column over here. All debit balances should be written down over here. We will have a credit columns where all the credit balances will be listed. I've also written down the name of all accounts prepared. Trade receivables, that comes from the sales ledger. Trade payables comes from the purchases ledger. Cash, bank, capital, sales, purchases, rent, and carriage come from the general ledger. Now whatever their balance brought downs were, please note this thing, balance brought downs will all be posted over here. If it's a debit balance, it should be written on the debit column. If it's a credit balance, it will go in the credit column. So now let me post down all their balances.
Quick pause. If you're finding value in this explanation, there's so much more to discover. At Alt Academy, we break down every A-level concept with the same level of clarity. Now, let's continue.
Okay, so now I've written down the balances. Trade receivable 1682, I've written that in the debit column. Trade payables, which is a liability, I've written down its balance in the credit column. Cash, you guys can see I've written that in the debit column. Bank is also an asset, by the way. If there's a bank overdraft, then this should come on the credit side of the trial balance. Capital is credit in nature. So is sales, which is an income that increases your capital. That's also on the credit side. Purchases, you guys can find that in the debit column. Rent and carriage expenses in the debit column as well. So as the nature implies, all assets and expenses, you guys can find them in the debit side of the trial balance. Capital, income, and liabilities, you guys can find that in the credit column over here. So this is essentially a summary of all T accounts prepared by the firm in the sales, purchases, and the general ledger. Okay, now what should happen in a trial balance? Since we're following the rule that for every debit, there should be a corresponding credit, the totals of the debit have to be equal to the totals of the credit. So now I would want you guys to first add up the debit column, then add up the credit column. And if we have done our work properly, the total of the debit column should be equal to total of the credit column. So I'll give you guys some time. Do try to first find the totals and then I'll show you the answer. Okay, now let me show the total of the debit column. If you had all the debit balances, you should get 8354. That's for the debit column over here. Now let's add up the totals for the credit column. Yeah, that's also 8354. So you can say your trial balance has now balanced over here, which means that the total of the debit side is equal to the total of the credit side. This is also an arithmetical check just to see if we've made any mistake in our ledgers. But the trial balance will now be used to prepare your financial statements. Okay, one thing to note about your trial balance. The balancing of the trial balance does not necessarily imply that there are no errors. We will obviously see this later in the topic errors and suspense videos, that your trial balance can still balance and there can be errors. However, we will try to contain our errors by preparing this trial balance, and you will use this trial balance to draw your financial statement. Alright, so in the next video, I will explain how to prepare financial statements using a trial balance. However, one thing to note, on your exam, you can expect a trial balance being given to you, but the basic logic of a trial balance comes from the fact that it has to be processed by the business, going through the day books, being entered in the ledgers as we just prepared, and using the balances in the ledgers, we prepare a trial balance which is then available to draw our financial statements. Alright, so from the next video, we'll cover the next step of preparing our financial statements and understanding how to communicate this information to useful decision makers.
Our complete A-levels accounting course is waiting for you on our website. In addition to accounting, you can also find business, economics, maths, and 4 other full A-level offerings. So thousands of students who've already unlocked their potential. Visit All to Get Me right now.